Hello again, Biology 300 students. Mr. Parker here, and in today's screencast, this is the Evolution Screencast Session 1. We'll be looking at the evidence of change that's going to lead to the ideas of evolution and Darwin's theory of evolution. Okay, as you can see on here is some Charles Darwin, his picture on the left there, and then on the right-hand side here we just have a fossil. So what I suggest you do is have out something to write with, obviously, and some notebook paper. Remember, I did not give you a graphic organizer for this one, so you should take out your own sheet of paper and take down the notes as we go through this. Okay, so first thing we have here is basically what does it mean to evolve, or the idea of what evolution is. Okay, evolution or to evolve is basically what we're saying is the change over time. And this belief is quite old and requires a great deal of evidence. As you've seen, as we go throughout the different screencasts, you'll see there's a lot of different evidence that I'm going to use in order to show you and help back up some of the information about the ideas of evolution. So I go ahead and jot down here that the definition of basically to evolve or evolution is a change over time. Okay, and you can see here on the bottom there's a picture. Basically, it's a stamp with Darwin on it, and then you see his finch birds that it's famous for. From the Galapagos Islands, which we'll talk about a little bit later in his voyage on the HMS Beagle. As the theories of evolution was being developed, okay, there's a lot of different things that's going to kind of give us more information about the diversity of life. Okay, you can kind of see here in the center, that's the question that we're looking at, what caused all this diversity of life. When you look at the immense amount of organisms that are out there, and then the ones that are now extinct, there's great variety in their shape, size, and ecological role. Meaning, ecological role is just meaning what their effect is on the environment, positive, negative, however it is. There's between 3 to 20 million different living species. Okay, I don't know. I look at that 3 to 20 million. It's a big range, but if you think about the different areas like the rainforests and the ice caps and Antarctica in that area, the depths of the ocean, there's a lot of areas that scientists haven't been able to explore, and that's just due to the fact of not reaching it yet. So that's why the number is so large. You can also see there that about 99% of all the species that ever lived are now extinct. Okay, which is kind of mind-blowing that there's only 1% of the species that are living. Okay, make up that 100%. And then there's a Permian-Triassic mass extinction period, which we'll talk about a little bit later. Just this mass extinction that occurred at this particular time period in basically the geological time period that we'll kind of take a look at a little bit later in different screencasts. And then this is just kind of showing you some of the diversity that Darwin was looking at. These are the Galapagos Islands finch birds and all the different types of finch. And you can kind of see the main difference there, as you're looking through this, would be the different beak shape. Okay, you can look at the different beak shape, obviously also the color shape. But when you look at the different beaks, that's going to basically was determined by what type of foods they were going to eat, and that they could get a hold of. It was either digging in, like here they'd be digging into some of the holes within the trees, and here these organisms would be more like seed eaters. Okay, being able to have powerful bills that would be able to crush those seeds for them to eat. Okay, so Charles Darwin obviously is famous for the ideas of evolution, but I'll just kind of give you a quick little background on him. He studied medicine and theology. He excelled in geology and biology, and in 1831 he set sail on the voyage of the HMS Beagle. And really, his role wasn't a real big scientific role. It was more of just he was going to develop these maps for the country and the different areas as they went on their voyage and went around the different islands and different continents. And he was the ship's naturalist. He was going to take some notes on what type of organisms that he was seeing, just make some basic observations. He had no intention of going there and to develop a theory of how things changed over time. Okay, so that's Charles Darwin, a little bit of basic information about him. In the previous picture you can see with the young Charles Darwin, and here's quite a little bit older Charles Darwin after his theories were developed and his books were written and going through there to the origin of species. Okay, I'm going to show you a quick little video here that's going to kind of give you some basic information about Darwin and some of the background of the theory of evolution.
The Mount was the birthplace of Charles Darwin and his home for the first 28 years of his life. Charles spent his boyhood in a sedately secure household. With a mother who was so frequently ill and confined to her room, the older sisters took care of young Charles. In the summer of 1818, Charles Darwin boarded at the Anglican Shrewsbury School, joining Erasmus, who had been there for 3 years. Founded by Edward VI in 1552, the old school buildings, which are now the headquarters of the County Library Services, stand on the rise opposite the castle. Charles's name appears in the school admission register for August, and again in the Midsummer School List of 1820 in Lower 4-2. Charles himself was an avid collector and recorder of his findings. The practice had started when he was a small boy. With the gardener, Aberley, he would record the number of plants and blossoms in the garden of the Mount. He became aware of insects too, as objects of interest, about the age of 10, noting that some of the beetles and moths of North Wales were different from those of Shropshire. The Beagle finally sailed in December. Although no remedy ever cured his dreadful seasickness, Charles regarded the voyage as by far the most important event of his life. He collected specimens of all classes, especially those less well known in Europe. He briefly described and roughly dissected many samples, skinning and drying some and preserving over 3,000 in spirit of wine. The turning point for Charles was his 5-week visit in 1835 to the Galapagos Islands, 600 miles out in the Pacific. The plants, animals and reptiles populating these geologically new islands must have come from the mainland South America, yet they were different from those species. He is the most transparent man I ever saw, particularly affectionate to his father and sisters, and perfectly sweet-tempered.
I think you will soon teach me there is greater happiness than building theories and accumulating facts in silence and solitude.
In July 1837, Darwin began a series of notebooks on biology to gather thoughts and facts relating to the origin and evolution of species. With the help and encouragement of distinguished scientific friends, his literary output began. On the strong advice of Lyell and Hooker, Darwin prepared a volume on transmutation. It was a bestseller, but its theory of evolution rocked Victorian society. It was seen to challenge God's creation of the world, since its central idea was that animal species, mankind included, had evolved from primitive forms over many millions of years. It was controversial. By the time of his death in 1882 from heart complications, Darwin had become a famous man, acknowledged as a great thinker and scientist in his own lifetime. He was buried in Westminster Abbey among other great men.
Alright, so now that you have seen the video, a little bit about Darwin's life and some little bit basic information about the evolution theory. What I'd like you to do is make sure you jot this down, the 3 different points on this particular slide on Darwin's conclusions. Okay, so number 1, Darwin reasoned that adaptations will result from natural selection and result in evolution. The physical traits and behaviors enable organisms to survive and reproduce and called fitness. And the last one there is fitness results from adaptations. Okay, so really and truly the first basic one that you should jot down is this one on top. Okay, that physical traits and behaviors enable organisms to survive and reproduce. And this is what we call fitness. Okay, so the fitter the organisms are, the more likely they're going to survive and reproduce and be able to pass along their particular traits or alleles that's going to make basically that particular species better off. Okay. The second conclusion that Darwin came up with is that fitness results from adaptations. So in order for these organisms to be more fit for their environments or to survive and reproduce, they have to be better adapted to their environment. And the better adapted they are, the more likely they're going to survive and reproduce. it just basically, it makes sense. Nature's going to select for these organisms that can survive the conditions wherever they live, and if they can survive, they're more likely going to reproduce. Okay, so we have this particular one here on fitness, adaptations, and then the last one here is Darwin reasoned that adaptations are a result from natural selection and result in evolution. Okay, so these adaptations that you have here. Sorry about that. I'm doing the screencast at school. So the adaptations that are resulted from this idea of natural selection, basically that nature is the driving force, okay, behind evolution. Nature's going to select for those organisms that are better suited for their environment. If it's a random mutation that occurred that makes them fit in, make them better suited to reproduce, and that's what nature's going to select for them. Okay, so these are Darwin's 3 conclusions that you see here, and you should definitely have these jotted down in your notes. Okay, and from here we're going to kind of take a little bit more about Darwin to kind of give you some more background about him and about how he came up with those conclusions. And basically, what you can see here, this is the HMS Beagle. Okay, and that's the ship that he sailed on and did all his work on. And then you can kind of see his route that he took and all his different ports of call that he took within the HMS Beagle, and we'll kind of take a closer look here at basically the different islands that he visited. All right. So, as Darwin, through Darwin's travels that he was taking on the HMS Beagle, he had the ability to go out there and collect fossils and other evidence. Okay, and this was allowing him to basically gather more information, just gather and make more observations about what's going on. So by collecting these fossils, okay, and then besides that, he was making some detailed drawings of organisms that he encountered within the different islands, not just the Galapagos Islands, but all the different islands he was visiting. And then he makes these detailed observations about the animal behavior. By putting all these things together, these fossils he had, the drawings he had, the observations he made, he was really and truly the first scientist that had so much information, so much factual information to back his thoughts and beliefs on what's how things changed over time. Okay, so these are some of Darwin's collections that he was able to gather as he was going through his voyage. You can see here, this is the Voyage of the Beagle, HMS Beagle. These are all the different locations that they stopped at. You can see here is the famous Galapagos Islands that he visited. He made a lot of his big observations and data collections that he's famous for. Okay, and here's another kind of just a picture of the Galapagos Island. Okay, and what he noticed through these archipelago, which is basically a group of islands, that's what this basically means, is a group of islands. He noted that the populations of organisms were slightly different from place to place. Okay, so even though this set of islands is very close to each other, as he traveled from one island to the next, he noticed that there was a difference, okay, between the same type of organism from one island to the next. And each group was modified to this specific environment, meaning that they were better suited for their environment. At the time, it wasn't so much talking about adaptation, but they were better adapted to the environment, so they're able to survive and reproduce more, and that means they have a better fitness, which will allow them to pass on their genes and their traits. Okay. Real quick, I'm going to jump out of this and going to visit a little web page on the Galapagos Islands. You can kind of see a satellite view or image of it, the Galapagos Islands. And you can see North America, South America, and here's our set of Galapagos Islands. We're going to kind of zoom in on it. Okay. And then we're going to kind of take a little bit of a look at some of Darwin's work real quick. You can see his voyage. This is some of his first impressions. And kind of just give you a little tidbit, a little sound bit from this scientist and what he, on Sean Carroll, what he
So 175 years ago, Darwin landed here, 26-year-old kid, really with no notion of ever discovering something as great as he did. So he came here, he only stayed 5 weeks, and he was happy to go. I mean, he was not physically attached to this place at all. It was only later in the voyage, when he had a little bit of extra time to organize his notes from the Galapagos, that he started thinking about what he had seen. And it dawned on him, species change. Now he had an idea. Now he had something to work on when he got back to England. And that's what he worked on for the next 20 years like a fiend, and really for the rest of his life. So this place gave him the direction in life that he didn't have up to that point.
Okay, so that was one of his first impressions, his first stops, and kind of moving on to the second stop here. You can see Darwin the collector, and we're going to listen again to
What
Sean,
Darwin was
what
doing
Sean
while
has
he
to
was
say
here is he
about
was
it.
collecting. He was taking notes of what existed in terms of plants, animals, rock samples, paying close attention to how many islands there were and what the different climates were on each of the islands, what the different landscapes were, volcanic craters, thinking about how the islands had come to be. So the Darwin that arrived here was not the great theorist that we know today. He was a 26-year-old collector, collecting really almost at random any kind of plants, any kind of animals, any kind of rocks. He didn't even know the meaning of what he was collecting until much later. But one of the knacks that Darwin had was he realized when he collected in a particular place how variable individual species were. And that's what led him to his key insight. He realized that not every individual was the same, stamped out like a toy from a press, but there was variation. And that variation might mean that some individuals were better than others at whatever that might be, eating particular types of food, running away from predators. And then that idea percolated, and he realized that would eventually lead to very different forms of species.
Okay, so from being the collector, moving on to a third location, you can see here is he was looking at different types of tortoise. All right, and we're not going to take a listen to Sean on this one, but we'll move on to the next one, the island site that he visited. And here he was looking at the finches. So we're going to take a listen.
When
here
Darwin went to the Galapagos Islands, it was things like mockingbirds, tortoises that really started prompting his thinking about evolution. What's interesting is the birds that bear his name, Darwin's finches, were so uninteresting to him that he didn't even bother to write down where he collected them. And the reason was they were all sort of gray, nondescript, black birds, but they were living on lava. They should be black. The fact they were the same color didn't matter. And their beaks were so different, and their lifestyles were so different, he didn't even realize they were related. He was back in England when an ornithologist friend of his told him that, hey, you know, all these birds you have here over on this side of the room, they're all kind of finch warbler-like things. They're very closely related. Well, as soon as he was told that, he instantly understood what it meant. And what it meant was that must have been an ancestral bird that came when there was a time when the only birds on the Galapagos Islands were seabirds. A land bird made it out there, a finch. And it had no competition. There were no other birds who were eating cactus, who were eating insects, who were eating seeds. All of these food sources were available to it. And by modifying its beak, it was able to take advantage of them all. And Darwin immediately understood all that and used that then as a very prominent example when explaining how evolution actually worked.
Okay, so from moving from Darwin finches to one of the last spots on this his voyage here, you can see the Darwin's the big
first
picture.
mystery
Sean's going to come
in
back
Darwin's
and
time
talk to
was,
you about
do
that one.
species even change? Were species just created in an instant and placed in a particular place on Earth to exist for a particularly specified period of time and then, I guess, perhaps disappear? Or did species come from other species? And what Darwin figured out was that species come from other species. And I think a tremendous advantage Darwin had was his geological training. He understood time. And the only way you could imagine this whole pageant unfolding is if you had enough time. And he realized the Earth was much older than people at the time had been thinking. And that gave a whole lot more time for the evolutionary process to unfold. And so his leap of imagination was that there was enough time for very simple things to evolve into very complex things, and many, many, many different complex things to evolve.
Okay, so now that Cliff and Sean have given you some more information about Charles Darwin and a little more background about his voyage through the Galapagos Islands, we're going to go ahead and return back to our PowerPoint and kind of begin wrapping up this particular screencast. You've already jotted down this information about some of the basic things that Darwin noticed, but you just go ahead and jot down some of the main type of organisms he looked at. The first one was the marine iguana and the land iguana. And you can definitely tell here, look at the difference in colors and how adapted they are to their environment. And this is what Darwin started observing and noticing as he went from one island to the next, or different locations within the same island, how they're better adapted and makes them better suited for survival and reproduction. Okay? The tortoise we kind of looked at within the website before, but here you can see just different shapes, size, Their legs are different, just depending on where they're going for reproduction or where they live and or spend most of their time, if they're on land or sea. The other one, which is the famous one, is the Galapagos finches. Okay, you can kind of see the different colors here, the different shapes of their beaks. Let's go ahead on to the next slide here. You can definitely see these are more your insect eaters. Okay, you can see the bills are a little bit more pointy. And then here you can see definitely the seed eaters, because they have to have the thick bill for pressure to be able to open up the seeds that they want. Okay, so again, Darwin's finches are a perfect example of this small set of island had all these different type of finch birds, just because they're better suited for their environment. Whatever food source was available, nature has selected for those particular organisms. Okay, so just kind of wrapping up this first screencast on Charles Darwin and kind of the development of the evolution theory and Darwin's conclusions on what he had noticed through fitness and the organism being better adapted to their particular environment, which will allow them to survive and reproduce, and how nature is the driving force behind the idea of evolution, selecting for those organisms that are better suited for their environment. So this was screencast session number 1 for evolution, and when you come back into class, we'll take a little bit more look at this, and we'll be adding on to this as we move into screencast session number 2.